It's Yukiri Reimu. It's Yukiri Marissa. Kimchi has been getting really cheap at the supermarket lately. That might be due to the impact of the Korean economy. Is it possible that Korea is in trouble right now? Oh man, this is seriously no joke. The currency has plummeted, and companies are going bankrupt one after another, and no one is helping them. What the heck? Question mark. How did it get to this point? They're on the brink of collapse. But I have the impression that Korea relies on Japan when it's in trouble. But wait. This time, Japan flatly refused. What? Japan didn't listen to their usual request for help. That's right. And they made it clear that they won't help because they've lost trust. Isn't that incredibly painful for Korea? It's not just painful. It's shaking everything up, including their economy, diplomacy, domestic politics, and so on. It's like a complete collapse of trust. In this video, we'll explain the dramatic background to this. Take your time. Without further ado, the Korean economy is on the verge of collapse. It's true that they're making such dramatic statements about collapse. The currency crisis is like a sinking ship, with a chain reaction of collapses and old companies. It's like the currency crisis of 1997. That's right, it's similar to 97, but maybe even more serious. Back then, the IMF in Japan helped, but this time, Japan turned its back. What? Japan didn't help? Oh, so the South Korean government asked Tokyo for help, but they got a cold, negative response. Why? They helped before, didn't they? That's the crux of the matter this time. Japan helped in 97, but South Korea's attitude after that was just too much. What do you mean? You mean they turned the tide? That's exactly it. At that time, Japan helped through huge financial aid and currency swaps. On top of that, they worked hard to improve the South Korean economy. Wasn't that a huge amount of support? Yeah, but then the South Korean government blamed Japan for historical issues and even started a campaign to stop selling Japanese products. That was certainly a shock for the people who helped. Right? That's why this time both the Japanese government and the people firmly refused. It seems like there's no going back on someone who has betrayed their trust. But if the economy is in trouble, wouldn't it be better to help them? Normally, yes, but this time it's different. Trust is like a currency. Once it's lost, it's hard to recover. I see. So it's a matter of trust. Furthermore, the current state of the South Korean economy is largely a result of its own actions. What do you mean? Isn't the economic crisis the fault of the world's situation? Of course, external factors aren't the only ones. South Korea's economic policies were too reckless. They relied too much on debt and became too biased toward a structure centered on the chaebols. So the structure is already precarious? Oh, and they were also too complacent, thinking that someone else would come to their rescue. That's exactly what they're asking Japan for support. Wow, they were operating on the assumption that they would be helped. But this time, Japan has completely shattered that illusion. In other words, Japan has essentially declared that it will no longer help them unconditionally. Isn't that a very painful decision for South Korea? That's right. Not only will they be economically isolated, but they will also be diplomatically isolated. This isn't just a financial problem, it's a crisis of trust. Trust? Money can't buy it, so I think so. That's why this rejection is being called a historic ruling. South Korea has paid the price for trust itself. While we're at it, let's talk a little more in detail about what happened in 1997. When South Korea was on the verge of collapse due to the coronavirus pandemic, Japan was the first to lend a helping hand. Was Japan really that big of a help? Yes, in addition to financial aid worth billions of dollars, it also provided a full set of currency swaps and economic support. Japan was effectively the old savior, on par with the IMF. So South Korea must have been incredibly grateful, right? Unfortunately, that gratitude didn't last long. A few years after the crisis, criticism of Japan began to resurface due to historical issues. Wait a minute, you're complaining to the country that helped you? It's hard to believe, but that's the reality. It was a response that could easily be described as ungrateful. That happens to the Japanese people too. Of course, public sentiment cooled, and more politicians began to say no to aid. Particularly symbolic was the campaign to withhold Japanese products. Oh, I remember that one. It was quite a topic of conversation. It wasn't a temporary movement, it was a national policy fueled by political leadership. What's more, behind the scenes, there was a scheme to use half a day for domestic control. Oh, it was being used that way. Using history as a political tool is an act that gradually destroys relationships with other countries. Japan received such a favor from a country it had supported once. So it's only natural that Japan would refuse if South Korea asked for support again. That's right. This time, the memory of being betrayed was the key. Trust between nations can't be bought with money. Once it's broken, it's never enough to repair, no matter how many decades it takes. What's more, South Korea continued to demand an apology and compensation from Japan. It seems like Japan is always being attacked. It's as if they took it for granted that Japan would support them. But this time, Japan has finally broken free from that illusion. Not providing support wasn't just an economic decision, it was a clear message. If they don't make an effort to regain trust, they won't help. That's exactly right. Nearly 70% of the Japanese people were opposed to supporting South Korea. In a democratic country, the government's decisions are influenced by the ruling class. They felt that the voice of the people was no longer being fooled. That's right. The government was also pushed to refuse support. And Japan doesn't have the financial means to do so. Oh, I hear that Japan is also struggling with a low birth rate and an aging population. The national debt exceeds 260% of GDP, and on top of that, they have to increase defense spending. It's impossible to be asked to support another country in such a situation. That's why the Japanese government calmly confronted them this time. Of course, it's not a cold country. And the problems with the South Korean economy aren't a temporary shock. Long-standing structural vulnerabilities have finally burst. What was so wrong with the structural aspect? The first big thing is the rapid increase in the minimum wage. By 2025, the minimum wage exceeded 10,000 yen. Wait, isn't that a good thing for workers? At first glance, it may seem like it, but in reality, it's actually the opposite. Many small and medium-sized businesses could no longer bear the cost. Unable to pay wages, production was cut back and businesses closed down one after another. Oh, so when people went home, their jobs disappeared? That's right. So they intended to protect jobs, but ended up destroying them. Small restaurants, family-run businesses, and local businesses, the microcosms of the economy, were all destroyed. Those are the things that support the local economy. Naturally, regular employment has decreased, and people are now mostly working part-time or temporary jobs. Their lives have become unstable, and they have no insurance and no future. What's more, while wages are rising on paper, the number of jobs has decreased, and real incomes have actually decreased. Wow, how ironic. To make matters worse, household debt has exploded. South Korea's household debt exceeds 90% of GDP. This is the worst among developed countries. 90%. How much debt do you have? With real estate prices skyrocketing, the only way to buy a house was to borrow money. But now real estate prices are plummeting. As a result, only the loans remain, and owning a house has become more of a necessity than a dream. With high interest rates, more and more people are having to give up their homes because they can't keep up with the repayments. Oh, I never thought that owning a home would become a life trap. What's more, many people rely on credit cards. Their salaries aren't enough to live on, so they end up living off debt. Young people, housewives, and middle-aged people all live off credit cards. Isn't that completely dangerous? That's why South Korea is currently in a state of revolving credit hell on a national scale. Even though the economy appears to be moving, in reality it's just running on debt and financial aid. If that were the case, it would collapse all at once. Yes, that's exactly what's happening now. Consumption is falling, investment is halting, and corporate bankruptcies are accelerating. Small and medium-sized enterprises in particular are in shambles. Isn't it okay because we have the chaebols? At first glance, the chaebols appear stable, but in fact, their very structure is the root of the problem. An economy that relies heavily on chaebols has lost its diversity and flexibility. Moreover, when chaebols cut costs, the small and medium-sized businesses that depend on them are the first to be cut. So while large corporations are saved, small companies disappear. That's right. That's the reality that's happening all over the country right now. If things continue like this, the Korean economy will collapse from the bottom up. Things have gotten out of hand. And the most symbolic of all economic events is the collapse of trust in the currency. Is trust in the currency really that important? It's incredibly important. Currency is not just money, it's a symbol of the credibility of the nation itself. That book was recorded in 2025 by the Thai dollar, which fell by 13% in a historic way. Isn't 13% a pretty serious drop? Oh, that's the worst level since the Asian financial crisis in 1997. But that's not the only problem. The people themselves have begun to feel that they don't want to own a currency. Everyone has started selling their coins and fleeing to things like Bitcoin, to cryptographers. You wouldn't do that unless you were really anxious. That's right. Moreover, the fact that the people are running away from the time change is like a death sentence for the economy. The movement to sell stocks and buy cryptocurrencies and flee to overseas assets has become unstoppable. So the people have lost faith in the time? That's right. It's like they've lost even hope that the country will do something about it. The collapse of a currency has a bigger psychological impact than just the numbers. After all, the economy is ultimately driven by the power of belief. When trust in the currency, companies, employment, and the future is lost, society itself begins to become aware of it. So how did the government respond? They tried various things, such as raising the central bank's interest rate and intervening to force people to buy, but the effects of all of them were temporary. The problem wasn't interest rates or policy, it was the collapse of trust. It was a situation that couldn't be fixed with painkillers. The more I heard, the more it seemed like it wasn't the end. In fact, the appearance of the city gradually changed. The shopping district that had been there before was replaced by a deserted street. Young people could only find part-time jobs and were forced into a situation where they had no hope for the future. That thing about finding a job. Furthermore, many families who had bought a house were unable to pay the mortgage. The real estate market in Seoul was completely silent. The myth of owning a home has completely collapsed. The currency is unbelievable. The lack of jobs and homes is also a major source of despair. Furthermore, capital is rapidly disappearing from South Korea as assets are fleeing the country. The people, who are said to have contributed billions of dollars in 2023 alone, have abandoned the economy. At this point, the country is on the verge of collapse. Even so, the government was still counting on support from outside. They were convinced that Japan in particular would help them again. How could they have had such high expectations after all the betrayals they had suffered? That's true. However, the shattering of those expectations further strained the psychology of South Korea. They were confronted with the reality that no one would help them anymore. As a result, demonstrations broke out in various places and discontent exploded. What? Has it already reached the level of social unrest? Yes, many people's lives were disrupted by the high prices, especially food and daily necessities. The prices of food and daily necessities have increased by 100% compared to the previous year. In other words, everything has doubled. It doesn't matter if the silver goes up. In fact, life has only gotten harder. So this Korean economic crisis isn't just a change in the landscape, it's a terminal symptom of the loss of trust in society as a whole. It doesn't seem like it'll be resolved anytime soon. Another thing we can't overlook about this Korean economic crisis is its reliance on chaebols. Chaebols are companies like Samsung and Hyundai, right? That's right. In Korea, chaebols have been at the center of the economy. They have certainly made a major contribution from the post-war reconstruction to the old days. But now, that centralized structure is reaching its limits. The power of chaebols is too strong, and they're crushing medium-sized companies and startups. Wait, isn't the economy more vibrant when there's competition? That's right, in principle. But the business environment in Korea is run by chaebols. It's hard for startups to grow, and there's no competition. If you take on a challenge, you'll either be absorbed or crushed. You're just looking at the future. That's right. As a result, the Korean economy has become a battle between a few giants and the weak. The chaebols may look stable, but their foundations are in tatters. What do you think big companies do to survive, especially in times of crisis? Like restructuring and cost-cutting? Yes, that's exactly it. Non-core divisions are cut, and subcontractors are the first to be sacrificed. In other words, small and medium-sized companies are thrown away without being supported or killed. That's why local companies are going bankrupt one after another. So this structure of being under the umbrella of a giant corporation suddenly becomes a weakness in times of crisis. There is no free competition, no innovation. If young people can't get a job at a chaebol, they will only be left with unstable jobs. It means they have no dreams. The reason why young people in Korea can't get jobs or be employed is because of this structure. The country is losing economic diversity. But hasn't that been said for a long time? That's right. Even though experts were calling for succession, the government relied too much on the chaebols and didn't push for reforms. As a result, the entire economy has become a one-legged system. And that one leg is now shaky. So if the chaebols collapse, the whole country will collapse? It sounds extreme, but it's exactly right. That's why society as a whole is now caught in a cycle of despair. Companies are collapsing, employment is decreasing, and consumption is shrinking. That in turn is causing further hardship for companies. It's a spiral of despair. Reliance on chaebols is accelerating the spiral. Chaebols are merely the skeleton. But the flesh that makes those bones move is small and medium-sized enterprises and startups. If you cut those out, of course it won't be able to move. When you think about it that way, the current Korean economy may be intact on the surface, but it's hollow inside. Yes, it's a hollow structure. They realized that too late. The economy collapsed and society sank. All that was left for Korea now was diplomacy, but in reality, that diplomacy has also become completely isolated. Not only the economy, but diplomacy is also isolated. Yes, this is the situation that is said to be the $3 billion zone. Economic collapse, social unrest, and international isolation. The first trigger was Japan's refusal to provide support. The South Korean government was counting on Japan to come to their aid when they were in trouble. They thought Japan would come to their rescue. But this time, Japan completely refused. That's right. And it wasn't just a blunder. It was a refusal that called for historical issues and past behavior. In other words, it was a diplomatic decision. It was a clear case of South Korea selling its balance sheet to its past indulgence. Wow, that's incredibly heavy. The problem is that when Japan closed its door, other countries followed suit. It was like a domino effect. The US started to take a cautious stance, and the EU backed off. China was too busy with economic issues to look after South Korea. As a result, South Korea couldn't get any support from anywhere. What? No one would help? Yeah. And the last option left was to ask the IMF for help. They were forced to make a decision that could be described as a repeat of the humiliation of 1997, the trauma of 1997 all over again. That's exactly right. Bowing down to the IMF means you have to be prepared to hand over your economic achievements. Because it would mean outside interference in national policy. Isn't that the biggest defeat for a country? That's why the South Korean government postponed making a decision until the very end. But it didn't turn out to be anything. The currency is collapsing, businesses are going bankrupt, and society is exploding with discontent. And not just domestically. South Korea has been labeled a dangerous country in the international market as well. And the most symbolic of all was the condition that Japan presented. Condition? Are you talking about money? No, that's not it. Japan didn't want money, it wanted attitude. The condition was to show an attitude of abandoning the half-day policy. That's a lie. In other words, it just means that in exchange for support, you have to return trust. Changing past behavior became the minimum condition for receiving help. This was a story that shook the axis of politics. After all, South Korea has been playing politics with the half-day card, hasn't it? That's right. That half-day policy was the basis of the ruling party's support. If they abandon it, the government might fall. But if they refuse, the country's economy will collapse. It's a complete self-defense fiend. Wow, no matter which choice they make, it's hell. Yes, there was no other option left. What made matters worse was the actions of the United States. Although they were neutral on the surface, they said behind the scenes that they understood Japan's position. In other words, the United States also dictated Japan's conditions. Does that mean that even the IMF needs Japan's influence? That's right. Japan and the United States hold important positions in the IMF. Without our consent, the IMF's doors won't open. Furthermore, South Korea is being forced to accept the position that it is an untrustworthy country. This is not a short-term issue, but will cause significant damage for decades. That's right. Furthermore, the abandonment of the half-day policy that Japan demanded as a condition for IMF support caused a huge stir within South Korea. Of course it did. After all, they had been doing politics on a half-day basis for many years. Oh, and now they were suddenly told to stop. In order to gain support, they had to deny the pillars of their politics. Naturally, the country was divided into factions, and that division surfaced as a conflict between generations of government officials. Opinions differed depending on age group? That's right. The older generation and the younger generation had completely opposite reactions. The older generation was furious. They felt betrayed and humiliated. To them, Japan was a historical perpetrator, an enemy, a country that had failed to help them in times of crisis. I see. For those who lived through the war and the occupation, those feelings were still very real. That's right. They kept shouting, "Don't forget, don't do it." But the younger generation reacted completely differently. Social media was flooded with criticism, such as, "Are we going to rely on Japan again?" And, "This isn't the time to spend half a day here." I'm surprised that the younger generation is more against Japan. No, it's not that they're against Japan, they're simply looking at reality. They grew up in a globalized society, interacted normally with people overseas, and witnessed domestic political corruption. So they're looking at it with a cold eye, even after spending half a day here. They're basing their judgment on reality, not emotion. That's exactly right. For the younger generation, the problem is not the conflict with Japan, but the lack of jobs and a future. As a result, a serious clash broke out between generations. Arguments are raging both at home and on social media, and things are getting out of hand. It's not serious enough that there's so much conflict within families. In fact, there have been many stories of children telling their parents and grandparents to stop complaining about Japan, which has made the atmosphere even worse. This generational shift is a new crisis for Korean society. Furthermore, there are increasing numbers of young people who say they don't need support from Japan and that they should rebuild themselves. It sounds great, but isn't it difficult to do in reality? Of course, it's idealistic, but behind this, there is a strong sense of dissatisfaction that the country should no longer be led by emotion. In fact, some scholars and media outlets have begun to take action. They say that the half-day policy has only brought economic losses. And this sentiment is spreading rapidly. For the first time, Korean society has entered a stage where it is reflecting on its own diplomacy. After all, it has been blaming Japan for this reflection. And now, it has finally begun to acknowledge that it was its own fault. And the symbol of this is the departure of politicians. Politicians who had been given instructions in half a day for many years are now being held accountable, criticized by the media, and defeated in elections. And in their place has emerged a new leadership style that emphasizes practicality and is realistic. Korean society is changing. So they've finally started to wake up from their illusions after going through a crisis. They've realized that they can't create a future with past hatred. Japan's refusal to provide aid hurt Korea. That's true, but more than that, it may have given Korea a much-needed awakening. Now it's up to Korea to learn what they can really learn from it. Can they choose their future with responsibility, not indulgence? That's the question at hand. That's all for the explanation. Was it easy to understand? So, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. Come back again and relax.